Greetings and salutations. This has been a video I've been meaning to do. Wanted to do it last week on morale and reaction roles. However, I was sick last week, and as you can hear, I'm not totally, excuse me, totally 100% over it. I'm dealing with the chest congestion that's still left, and I'm a little croaky. But be that as it may, we're going to continue on anyway. I feel well enough to do this. I'm 98% back. So anyway, reaction rolls and morale checks. So reaction rolls and morale are something that have fallen out of favor in the more modern systems. Um, I believe that there are optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, but they're not in the core rules themselves. I find it a shame because this is what actually this randomness actually brings a character to the game. If it's not predictable to the dungeon master or the game master or the referee or whatever you want to call it, if it's not predictable to them, that's not predictable to the players. And this creates a situation that, in my opinion, is more enthralling than something that's been planned out, like a story, a big sweeping story. People actually put too much stress on game masters and dungeon masters to be these grand storytellers when that's not really our job, right? So that's not our job. Our job is to be a referee. The story comes from the gameplay. The core, you don't go. Okay, I've never been hunting for the sake of telling a hunting story. I've never gone fishing for the sake of telling a fishing story. The hunting stories and the fishing stories and the horseback riding stories, they just kind of happen. Like, for example, I went and I rode at Devil's Creek over by the Cumberland Falls when I was a teenager. Um, Took my horse. We ran into Yeller Jacket's nest, and I'm allergic, and I got lit up. Luckily, I didn't go in anaphylactic shock. I was fine, and my horse got ate up too. She got lit up pretty bad. Uh, be that as it may, I didn't go there planning to tell that story. So why should we run these games like that? This is what, in my opinion, makes a railroad. This is what makes a linear game experience. And it's not something that I'm a huge fan of. But the stories just naturally happen. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about reaction roles, right? So I'm on page 43 of the core rules for Basic Fantasy RPG. This is the third revision. It says edition on it, but it's really not an edition. When a group of player characters meet one or more monsters, it's important to know how the monsters will react to the party. In many cases, the reaction of a monster or monsters is obvious. Zombies guarding a tomb will virtually always attack intruders, for example. In cases where a reaction of the monsters to the party is not obvious, a reaction roll may be made. The Game Master rolls 2d6, adding the charisma bonus of the lead, quote, put in quotations, character, or applying his or her charisma penalty, along with any other adjustments he or she feels are reasonable, and consults the table below. On the table below, a two or less is an immediate attack. A 3 to 7 is unfavorable. An 8 to 11 is favorable. And a 12 or more is very favorable. A result of 2 or less means that the player characters have so offended the monsters that they attack immediately. An unfavorable result means that the monsters do not like the player characters on. Okay, sorry about that. Unfavorable result means that the monsters do not like the player characters and will attack if they may reasonably do so. Favorable result simply means that the monsters will consider letting the player characters live if they choose to parlay. It does not necessarily mean that the monsters like the player characters. A very favorable result means that the monsters are perhaps only the monster leader do in fact like the player characters. This does not mean that these monsters will just hand over their treasure, but it does indicate that they may choose to cooperate with the player characters in mutually beneficial ways. As always, interpreting the results of this role is left to the GM, who may choose to alter the result if he or she believes a different result would be more enjoyable to play out than the one role. Now, this is one of those instances where if you feel as GM that fudging the dice would actually work out in your favor, you may do so. Do so not necessarily because you don't like it. Do so because it makes the game enjoyable. Don't do it to give it an easier or harder time. In fact, in my opinion, if you're going to go one way or the other, now, so in my opinion, situations where I would or would not fudge these, okay, 2 or less with the immediate attack, or 12 or more with very favorable, I wouldn't fudge them at all. Where I would fudge is this middle ground here, the unfavorable and favorable. I would probably, at that point, if I felt so inclined, to bump up 1 or bump down 1 rank. So, favorable can either be unfavorable or very favorable, and the unfavorable could either be favorable or immediate attack. And so that's where I would take it. But for the most part, I don't recall a situation where I've ever fudged this dice roll. I believe I've let it play out. Now, sometimes I'll roll the dice just for the sake of the sound, so that my players know I'm checking for that. But for example, I want to go down to a monster I know right off the top of my head that will almost always immediately attack. That's not undead, by the way. The giant scorpion. It's up here somewhere. So, giant scorpion, described quite large, sometimes as large as a donkey. They are aggressive predators and generally attack on sight. Generally, does not always mean that they do all the time, but will be a situation in which it's favorable or very favorable to the characters. Now, this is one of those situations where, because this is an insect and a very giant one, and it's described as a very aggressive predator, I would say favorable and very favorable are the same thing, meaning that this thing will probably have been fed, like it just ate, for example. So it's not interested in the party walking by. Just fed, has no reason to attack. Even though it might be an opportunity predator, as a lot of scorpions are, I would leave it alone. I would just put it as it's full. It doesn't need. Now, immediate attack and unfavorable, I would consider the same thing. This thing is, well, maybe not. Immediate attack, self-explanatory. Unfavorable, I would probably rate that as this thing is guarding its nest and it's very territorial. Or maybe it's molting, as many arachnids and other invertebrates do. And an arachnid, somebody who has witnessed tarantulas and stuff like that molt, when they go into the molting process, they don't feed. They will quit eating, and they will go through this very long process of shedding their exoskeleton and then regrowing their carapace. And they have to wait for it to soften up, to harden up, because they're very soft. In fact, tarantulas are very notorious for not eating for a long time, even after the molting process is done, because their fangs are actually made from a particular type of metal. They're not made. It's like a mix of metal and keratin, but it's very soft when it comes out, and so they'll actually appear white, and they need to let it harden up. And so the tarantula will not actually eat for a while until that hardens up. So you could say the same with scorpions, even though they have different mouth parts than tarantulas. Um, they could you could make it this way. Maybe it's molting, doesn't want to eat, doesn't feel like a fight is worth it, or maybe it has freshly molted. I would say in situations like that where you have a fantasy creature based off of a real life creature, a little bit of research might help you a bit. I'm just going based off of the knowledge I know, for example. So I'm no arachnid expert, but I find them fascinating creatures. Now let's talk about morale. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video and go back up the section. Okay, so for those of you that watched my video on retainers, the first instance of morale being mentioned is that the morale of the retainer or the hireling. That's the first instance in the core rules of that being mentioned. On. Sorry, I had to do something that was gross and didn't want to put that on camera. But anyway, down here on page 49 of the core rule book. NPCs and monsters don't always fight to the death. In fact, most will try to avoid death whenever possible. This makes sense, especially player characters do this, and so it makes sense for NPCs and monsters to do so in the world too. This is supposed to be a living world. Each monster listing includes monster's morale score, figure between 2 and 12. To make a morale check, roll 2d6. If the roll is equal to or less than morale score, monster or monsters are willing to stand and fight. If the roll is higher than the score, the monster has lost its nerve. Monsters with a morale score of 12 will never fail a morale check. They will always fight to the death. This usually includes undead, for example. Undead are already dead, so they have nothing left to lose. In general, morale is checked when monsters first encounter opposition, and again when the monster party is reduced to half strength by numbers if more than one monster, or by hit points if the monster is alone. For this purpose, the monsters incapacitated by sleep charm or hold magic are counted as if dead. This is why I usually award XP for different things besides just straight up combat killing monsters. The game master may apply adjustments to a monster's morale score in some situations at his or her discretion. Generally, adjustments should not total more than +2 or -2. No adjustment is ever applied to a morale score of 12. A monster that fails a morale check will generally attempt to flee. Intelligent monsters or NPCs may attempt to surrender if the GM so desires, and I do run that. Note that special rules may apply to retainers. See the relevant information, and it talks about the section. So, let's take, for example, just because it's like right here, we have on the same page, we have two different monsters. We have the giant ant and we have the assassin vine. Actually, and we could actually use the carnivorous ape right here too. So with the giant ant, we see the morale check is 7 on first sighting. It's a 12 after being engaged in combat. So ants it says down here in the monster description, they're relatively shy when first encountered. Once combat begins, they will fight to the death. It is generally because an ant is never alone. You take a look at the number appearing section for just a random encounter would be 2d6. In the wild, it's 2d6, and in a lair, it's 4d6. So it's always got backup. So therefore, it's got a colony that, or perhaps it's a scout that it's doing it for the good of the colony, right? So it'll generally try on first sighting to return to the colony or to avoid combat altogether, as you know normal ants would. But after engaging in combat, ants are very vicious fighters in the insect world and will fight to the death, oftentimes because their numbers are so easily replenished. The hive mind is a very strange thing. It's just like um, let's consider another fictional monster though. The Xenomorph from the Aliens franchise operates off a hive mind, and they fight to the death. And it's for the good of the colony. They operate off a hive mind. Uh, they are about survival. It's this um, idea of Darwinism, right? The propagation of a species to be triumphant, natural selection, and so on and so forth. And so that's reflected in that fictional monster, but it's based off a real world application with ants. Let's take for example another example, carnivorous apes. Just a morale check of 7, right? So roll your reaction roll, whatever their reaction is. Uh, Act accordingly. But if combat is ensued, um, go ahead and roll a morale check whenever um, have power, whatever it happens to be in that situation. But then we have the assassin vine, for example. The assassin vine has a morale of 12. Why? Because it is an unthinking creature. It's a plant. Um, so it's a semi-mobile plant found in temperate forests that collects its own grisly fertilizer by grabbing and crushing animals and depositing the carcasses near its roots. So it needs to kill for its own survival. So therefore, it will not retreat. It will keep fighting, um, even to its own detriment. But with a hit die total of 6, where the bare minimum is 6 HP and the maximum is 68. 6 D8 dice, I should say, to clarify. I can't think of what the total would be right off the top of my head, but I believe it would be 48. Um, Again, but anyways, so um, the assassin vine, obviously would be a pretty formidable opponent for a party. It's probably one of those things where I would put it in a dungeon as a trap, so to speak, but I probably wouldn't throw this at an early level adventuring party myself. But do you. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your game. Um, so that's just a good example, right? So, um, it's just like we let's take similar similar monsters here. So we have different bears. We have the black bear. We have the cave bear, and we have the grizzly bear. The black bear has the lowest morale of 7. The cave bear has the highest morale of 9, and the grizzly has an in between of 8. And so, uh, as somebody who lives in an area with black bears are actually very timid. There's actually a saying: if it's black, fight back; if it's brown, get down. Play dead. Um, and so, cave bears and grizzly bears, based off of uh, their real world counterparts, where brown bears are more vicious predators than black bears are. Black bears are um, they're mostly scavengers. They're omnivores and they will take fresh meat and they will kill if they have to, but generally they're very shy. In fact, I see more dead black bears than I do living black bears because most of the time they get too close to the road and they get smashed by like a semi truck or something like that, a tractor trailer running into them. In fact, I saw one dead not too long ago. Whereas I don't have grizzlies or brown bears in my parts really, but having seen enough documentaries, they're very they can be very opportunistic predators. Um, Generally, they are more aggressive than the black bear, right? And so they will often fight and kill actively. Um, and they are considered more dangerous than the black bear because of that, because of their aggressive and defensive tendencies. But, anyways, so I'm starting to lose my voice, as you can hear. So, thank you for listening. I apologize for how my voice sounds, and thank you guys for all the subscriptions. I'm at 71 as of the date of this video, and I appreciate it. So, take care. God bless, guys, and as always, see you on the other side.